So we will start with the different stakeholders of the law and how do they stake up with the GDPR, right? So I'm gonna give a comparative view in terms of how the DPDP Act calls out these stakeholders and how the global law like GDPR is having a similar term, right? So the first is your data principle. So data principle is referring to an individual whose personal data is being collected, right? And the similar terminology that we see in GDPR is data subject. And it is important for us to understand the definition to some extent because sometimes they create confusions in our operations. Plus, sometimes the definition itself can give you a way of inferring few stuff, right? We will see that. Now, in terms of data subject can be a child, and also sometimes it can refer to different types of people and even people who are living or people who do not live. For example, in GDPR, we do not include the deceased people data. Basically, it's only about natural persons data. Whereas in the Indian law, it's like it's open, right? In many of the Middle East law as well, you will include both people who are deceased as well as people who are living as well, right? These are some of the nuances, right? And data fiduciary is your data controller, okay? And we have a similar term which is also called as joint controllership. And joint controllership as a concept is not being has been indicated in the DPDP Act. But I just like to ask this question to my candidates in terms of what is your understanding about the word fiduciary and data processor. So if you have to keep it a common term, what is your understanding about controller and processor? So a controller and a processor definition is actually not based on processing personal data. That's the first important point that you need to remember. There is a general misconception in terms of processing personal data is equated in terms of identifying a controller or a processor. Okay, there are two fundamental criteria for engaging or we calling someone as a processor. Okay, so the two criteria are that first one, the processor has to be independent entity, okay, than the controller. That's first. The second is the processor has to work on the instruction of a controller, right? So if you do not fulfill these two criteria, a processor cannot exist in any data processing scenario. Okay. Now there is another myth that exists is that a data processor is a compulsory stakeholder in terms of any data processing equation. Actually, answer is no. So data processor is a additional stakeholder who is just working on behalf of the controller, right? So the controller engages a data processor on their need, that they need someone to assist them in terms of certain operations. So in a data processing equation, we don't need to have a data processor for every single processing. That's one. The second is the controller also process personal data. That doesn't make them a processor. A data controller and data processor both process personal data. That's the reason I told you a very first point that processing personal data is not a criteria for defining either controller or processor, right? Now with that, how do I define a controller? Controller is any entity that decides the purpose for processing and the ways and means of processing. These are two underlying rule of thumb which helps you to decide. And there are a few more questions in terms of which entity decides the retention period, which entity decides to whom to share the data with, right? In terms of which entity created this entire underlying processing scenario. Every of these primary decisions are taken by the controller of the data. In this case, you are a data subject and the organization as a whole is a controller. There is no processor exist. But in the same scenario, if you are outsourcing a HRMS, right? There is a SAP solution, sorry, there is a ERP solution, or you are outsourcing this entire payroll processing to a third party. So in this case, that particular a third party will become the processor. I think Pradeep gave the answer initially correct. Okay, so whenever a processor has to be in the equation, it has to be a third party which has to be apart from the data controller. Your employees within the organization, your departments within the organization, they are all considered as one entity. Okay, so whatever we do within the organization, we will be accounted as one entity. Now, that doesn't discount the fact that you may have different roles based on the different processing activity. So let me give you an example. If you are working for a cloud service provider, right? So as a cloud service provider, or let's take a SaaS solution like the HRMS solution or any other ERP solution or SaaS solution provider. So there you will be acting as a controller for your own employees' data. Am I right? If I'm working for AWS, and my AWS will be taking my data, processing my data, giving my payroll, for so many reasons my data has been collected, right? So they are controller of my data. At the same time, the same AWS will be processor for all their clients, right? Basically all their clients entities are storing their data in AWS. In all these cases, AWS works as a processor. So within the same organization, you may wear different hats as a controller and processor, depends on the processing activity. For a same set of processing activity, you will not be able to play dual role as a controller, as a processor, but you will always act as any single role, which is controller, either controller or processor. But for different processing activity, like I gave an example, you will be playing different roles. Okay, so joint controllership as a concept doesn't exist in the DPDP Act, but it's a global stakeholdership that is defined, for example, in GDPR. So the difference is when two entities come together to define together the purpose of collection and ways and means of processing, that becomes your joint controllership. And sub processor is basically the processor is outsourcing to one more entity down the supply chain, right? So that's a example of so let's take an example. If uh, AWS example itself, right? So AWS is acting as a processor, but AWS again outsource some of technical storage requirement. They use a service of someone else downstream. They are all acting as a sub processor for the same processing activity, right? So basically, a sub processor is nothing but another entity who comes into part of this equation, where the processor is engaging them. And the to engage with any subprocessor, there are again two important conditions. One, the controller has to give permission to the subprocessor, and the reason here is it's a controller's data whom they are dealing with. And the second is the subprocessor will have to again enter into the same contractual obligation that the processor has entered with the controller, right? So the for the subprocessor, the processor will behave or act like a controller, right? So whatever obligations which are moved from the controller to processor, the processor will be moving those obligations to the subprocessor. See, subsidiaries are again end of the day different legal entities, correct? For example, if they are sending the data to their parent or sister concern, right? So your roles will depend on who is sharing, why you are sharing. So you will become a controller who is getting the data and processing for certain reasons, that they will become a processor of the data. End of the day, there are two different legal entities. Any sharing between them will either take the controller or processor. Okay, so this is between the group of companies. There is one more factor which I would like to elaborate and everyone to understand this. There is a possibilities of independent controllers working together. We spoke about joint controllership when two entities come together in terms of understand working together to define why we are collecting the data and how we are going to process the data. And let me give two examples so that you can both understand these two concepts very clearly. Okay, let's take an example where we have Make My Trip, okay, which is a travel aggregator. So they usually have tie-ups with hotels, airlines, or any travel sort of agencies, right? Now, tomorrow, Make My Trip plans to have a joint collaboration activity to do a marketing launch. So part of this marketing drive, they are giving special discounts towards airlines. Maybe let's take an example of Vistara is trying to have an exclusive deal with Make My Trip, and you will also get discounts for a particular hotel chain. Okay, so these three parties come together, they creating this marketing drive, and part of this marketing drive they will act as a joint controller, right? And so only for this activity they will act as a joint controller, and then subsequently each of these parties are acting as a controller for their set of other processing activity. For instance, once you get the lead, or once someone takes this marketing drive and gives their preference, and they pay some advance amount, then the subsequent processing to give a actual flight ticket, then in that case the airline will act as a controller for those sort of processing activity. So this is an example of joint controllership, where three parties or more than one parties come together to decide the purpose and ways and means of processing, right? So the case of joint independent controllers working together is in a case where let's take an example of, if you're trying to order Zomato food through Zomato, right? And you would see, when you're trying to complete your order, you would see in terms of a payment gateway which will come in between, in terms of moving your transaction to towards connecting a bank, and then finally the banking page will appear in terms of closing the transaction. So here the payment gateway and the bank which are involved completing that particular order, they are not processors of the data, but they are two independent controllers which are working with Zomato. How do I differentiate this? How do I know whether they are controller, processor, or two different controllers working together? It's very simple. So if the other parties are not working on your instruction, they are collecting the data and they work as independent parties, they don't sort of enter into a data processing agreement, and they don't listen to your instruction, or they are not working on your instruction, they are independent controllers. So in this case, Zomato cannot control how the personal data collected from you for fulfilling that particular transaction to be handled by the bank. So the bank collects the data in terms of whatever transaction happened. They have the independent obligation in terms of how long they will retain the data, how long they will process the data. All those decisions will be subsequently managed by the bank on their own set of terms. So here Zomato has a B2B relationship with the payment gateway as well as your bank, right? So in this case, there are three data controllers are working together. So there is no controller processor relationship, but multiple controllers working together. Okay, when I say data controller and processor, one entity has to work on the instruction of another entity, which is a controller. They will have a data processing agreement clearly signed to dictate what is the terms for two parties. Okay, so significant data fiduciary is about a very important term in the DPDP Act. So here they have given called out in terms of what which entity will fall into this category. They are given a very high level pointers who are dealing with a significant amount of or volume of personal data and sensitive personal data, and they will qualify as a significant data fiduciary. Mostly all the banks, insurance companies, the big IT companies, all of them are going to be falling into this category of significant data fiduciary. And with the significant data fiduciary identification, it becomes very important because you will be having those explicit obligations will be there. All right.